It was in the summer of 1875 that old Martin Keezar first took his granddaughter Alice to the river. It was her first trip, but for the elder Martin the number could no longer be counted on a single hand, or 2 or even 10. For a score of years he had come to the Merrimack, and amongst the fishermen and lovers and ramblers had wandered the river bank and searched through the rocks there. He came mostly after storms, when the river ran wild and muddy, and the bank had been churned over. None of his fellows knew why he came, or for what he was looking, for Martin was a private man and fearful of 2 things: that if they knew the truth of what he sought, they might think him mad, or worse, think him wise, and begin searching themselves. He told none of his fellows about what he was searching for, but he told his granddaughter as she searched with him in the cold and wild waters one spring morning. The sun was warm, and the sky a brilliant blue, the grass clean and still bright green, that crisp green that comes after a good rain. It was on a spring day like any other that Martin Keezar whispered in his granddaughter's ear and told her the family secret. He told her about the treasure that their ancestor had once possessed and had lost, what it was and where it came from. It was in Germany, in a black tower in the forests of Nettesheim, that the alchemist Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa first took out a piece of moonstone. It was of no particular value, but rather large and rectangular in shape, and bathed it in the light and chemical baths of his trade. He followed the method laid out in Ibon's grimoire, a process they say he stole from a cult who served an obscure rank of ethereal angels. When the treatment was done, the moonstone was instilled with a power to see through time. One still had to know the ways of a cunning man, the use of herbs and metals, and the secrets of the woods to make it work. But when it did, it opened wide, like a window into the future, or the past. The stone was too large for Agrippa's purposes, and so it languished in his workshop until one day he gave it to a cobbler, who also had been a minnesinger, in lieu of payment for services rendered. The cobbler was a most excellent cobbler, with a fine voice, but he wasn't a cunning man, and knew little of herbs or the forest. For him, Agrippa's stone was just a lapstone, good for shaping and softening leather, but nothing else. When he died he passed it and everything else of value to his apprentice, who carried it with him across the sea. That man, that cobbler's apprentice, was our ancestor, little Alice, and the founder of the American branch of the Keezar family. He was a clever man and a cunning one, and he knew how to use the lapstone and make it work. He knew other things as well, and the Puritans who had come to populate the land around the Merrimack often cast a foul eye in his direction, and some went so far as to accuse him of witchcraft, but nothing ever came of it. Old Keezar was too smart for those old stern-faced priests and their gossiping wives, and they never could find any free men willing to stand against him. He lived to a ripe old age, and in his dotage climbed the hill, and while using the lapstone it slipped and tumbled down the slope and then plunged into the river. He searched for it, of course, but as the years went by he grew older and weaker and finally passed away, but not before passing along the secret of the stone to his children. Since then the legend has been passed down through the generations, and all the Keezar men had searched for the lost lapstone of Cobbler Keezar, the scrying stone made by the alchemist Agrippa, equalled only, they say, by the black stone of Dr. Dee and the interpreters of Joseph Smith.
"How do you know it's still here? It could have been washed down river, or out to sea decades ago," asked little Alice as she worked her way along the edge of the river bank, her eyes searching for the legendary artifact.
Well, there are stories, Alice, of milkmaids and farm-hands and mill-workers and even fishermen who have fallen asleep on the banks of the river and had prophetic dreams. Dreams of love lost and found, dreams of children and family, even dreams of nations and the men who shape them. These dreams have come true. It's the lapstone, reaching out from the river and telling the special dreamers the future. It's here, Alice, I know it is, buried somewhere in the mud, lodge in nook, caught in the roots of a tree." She reached out with her spade and flipped a few rocks as Martin Keezar continued on down the winding Merrimack River.
"What would you do if you found it? Would you make the world a better place?"
"I would, Alice. I would make the world a better place for me, and your mother and father and you and all the Keezars."
She dug in the mud a little. "How?"
"If you know the future, if you know what's going to happen, then you can take advantage of it. You can know who to be friends with, and what things to buy and sell. You'll know when and where disasters will occur, and shortages and surpluses. We can use all that information, take advantage of it, and grow the family fortune."
He wandered round a copse of trees, just as Alice's spade hit something hard and oblong in the mud. She slid the blade under it, and leveraged it up. It popped out with a satisfying burp of air and mud. Alice knew almost instantly that she had found the lapstone. It was the right shape and size, and even scattered the light in an almost mystical manner. These were clues, surely, but what confirmed it was the vision that suddenly formed before her eyes. The lapstone was like a window, and the curtains slowly rolled back before her and showed her the future, or at least one possible future. With the lapstone in his possession, her grandfather was old, older than he was now, older than he had a right to be, and he was rich. He had grown rich off of the European War. The whole family was wealthy, she was wealthy, her younger brothers were wealthy, even her children were wealthy. Only death stopped Martin Keezar, and then, knowing the secret, Alice Keezar took over. When the Second War in Europe came, she used the lapstone, and the family grew even wealthier. Then there were wars in Asia, and in Central America, and then the Levant. The 20th century was a century of warfare, and through it all the Keezar family prospered, profiting off of war as if it were simply another business. When she finally grew old, Alice Keezar was older than her grandfather had been, older than anyone had a right to be, and when she almost died, the machines helped bring her back. They replaced her heart first, and then her liver. Multifolded things like books took up residency where her lungs once were. They took her stomach, and she was forced to stop eating solid food, and instead only drank a carefully cultured nutritional fluid. When her memory began to go, they transferred portions of her brain onto crystals of quartz, and lodged these in the empty areas of her skull. Her eyes were made of glass, and aluminum, and pure light. There were lawyers employed by her family, her children and her grandchildren, but they were useless against the battalion of solicitors that worked for her. She outthought them, outspent them, and outlived them all. In time the great family of the Keezars was gone. The reputation they had gained had left no one who would even consider marrying them, let alone bearing their children, and only she was left. On the occasion of her 300th birthday she was the Keezar family, rich, powerful, and utterly alone. She wondered the great house where she lived by herself, automatons on wheels and treads following about, fulfilling her every need. They weren't really automatons. They were slave clones, little bits of her own mind copied and edited down to become perfect little servants, extensions of herself in a way, and therefore not a security risk. She had been a target for assassination once. Martian separatists had planted a bomb in her car. They blamed her for something, but it didn't matter what, they were all dead. She had made sure of that. It didn't matter what happened. Alice Keezar was all. She was everything. Her wealth and knowledge would allow her to live beyond the lives of her friends, her enemies, the nations that rose up to oppose her, and those she created to defend her. She would become a goddess, and all would bow down to her forever. All this Alice Keezar saw through Agrippa's lapstone, the treasure of the Keezar family. All this Alice knew was because of the power the lapstone granted.
It was a great power, one that she could see could corrupt her grandfather and herself. There was another way, of course, another path through time. She saw her raise up the shovel and bring it crashing down on her grandfather's head. She saw herself becoming a teacher, an advisor to leaders, and then a leader herself. She saw the future and how the lapstone could be used to guide and inform and change the world. She saw others reject her wisdom, her advice, her guidance, and she saw the world plunged into chaos. She saw herself becoming ruthless, tyrannical, and even monstrous. She passed edicts like a petty dictator without explaining anything. She saw herself addicted to the moonstone, consulting it day and night, fretting over it, growing old and weak and frail as she forgot to eat or drink or sleep. She saw herself as a slave to the future, and to trying to change it. She saw the gaunt, reptilian Sibyl she would have no choice but to become. If she was to save the world, she must rule it, and herself, with an iron gauntlet. There were other futures. She could see them all, lining up, waiting to be played out, all waiting to be chosen, and to be reviewed. She felt sick. She was, after all, just a little girl, not nearly as smart as her grandfather. But she was wise, perhaps wiser than her grandfather. And then she lifted up her shovel, and in bringing it down as fast and as hard as she could, she showed just how wise she was. A moment later she ran to catch up with old Martin Keezar, and for many years after she often joined him in his walks along the bank of the Merrimack River. When he died he made her promise that she would continue to look for the stone. It was a promise that she made easily, for she had no intention to keep it. She had wisdom enough to lie to the old man, even on his deathbed. In time the young folk of the village stopped sleeping on the banks of the river. And without the dreams on the river-bank to remind them, the legend of Cobbler Keezar's lapstone faded into obscurity. Occasionally some historian or writer or fool would come to talk to the Keezar family about the old stories, but they knew nothing about it. The legend had ended with Martin, shattered and washed away into the deep waters of the Merrimack, just like the shards of the lapstone itself that Alice in her wisdom had shattered with her spade. She hadn't chosen the best future, or the brightest, for her, the family, or the world, but it was the one that she knew the least about, and therefore it was the only future she found she could truly enjoy.